July 23, 1948. Tempelhof Airfield, American Sector, West Berlin. The heat rose from the tarmac in visible waves, distorting the silhouettes of the Douglas C-47 transport planes as they descended one after another, their engines roaring in a rhythm that had become the city's new heartbeat. Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen stood near the chain-link fence at the edge of the airfield, his flight suit dark with sweat, watching a group of children who had gathered there every day for the past week. 30, maybe 35 of them, ranging from perhaps 6 years old to 14, their clothes faded and patched, their faces sharp with hunger. They pressed against the fence, silent, their eyes tracking each aircraft as it touched down with loads of flour, coal, and powdered milk that meant the difference between survival and starvation for the 2 million souls trapped in the western sectors of this ruined city. What struck Halvorsen, what had begun to haunt him during his off-duty hours, was their silence. These children did not beg. They did not reach through the fence or call out in broken English. They simply watched, hour after hour, as the Allied airlift performed its impossible mathematics. One plane every 3 minutes, around the clock, each one carrying hope measured in tons. He had seen children beg before. In the rubble-choked streets of Frankfurt and Munich, in the displaced persons camps scattered across the American occupation zone, he had watched German children swarm around GI trucks, hands outstretched, voices pleading in that universal language of want. But these children at Tempelhof were different. They stood as if at attention, witnesses to their own rescue, asking for nothing but what the planes already brought, the possibility of tomorrow. Halvorsen reached into his pocket and felt the 2 sticks of double mint gum that he had been saving since breakfast. It was a small thing, almost absurd in its smallness. What were 2 sticks of gum against the tonnage of need, against the calculus of a city under siege? But something in the rigid dignity of those watching children compelled him to walk toward the fence. 3 years earlier. April 19th, 1945. Somewhere, over Germany, the flak had come up fast, black flowers blooming in the sky around his B-17. Second Lieutenant Halvorsen, navigator, 24 years old, had felt the aircraft shudder as shrapnel tore through the fuselage. The mission, his 31st, was supposed to be routine. Pound the remaining Wehrmacht positions, soften them up for the ground forces advancing from the west. But the Germans, even in their death throes, still had teeth. The intercom crackled. "We're hit. Number 3 engine's gone." The pilot's voice, usually steady, had risen half an octave. Halvorsen watched through the bombardier's window as the German landscape tilted sickeningly. Fields, forests, and the dark snake of a river rotated into view. They were going down. The question was whether they would land or crash. The impact when it came felt like the fist of God. Metal screamed. Something sharp caught Halvorsen's left leg, and he felt a hot wetness spreading through his flight suit. The world became a confusion of smoke, the smell of aviation fuel, and the urgent need to get out before the plane became a crematorium. He remembered crawling, the emergency hatch, his crew chief pulling him clear, the blessed smell of earth and grass. Then voices in German, sharp commands, the cold circle of a rifle muzzle pressed against his temple. Halvorsen had expected to die then. Every briefing, every intelligence report, every rumor whispered in the officers' club had prepared him for this moment. The SS shot down airmen. The Hitler Youth hanged them from lampposts. The civilians, maddened by years of Allied bombing, tore them apart with their bare hands. This was what happened to Terrorflieger, the terror flyers who had turned German cities into ash. Instead, a Wehrmacht sergeant, old enough to be Halvorsen's father, his field gray uniform faded nearly white, had looked at the blood pooling around the American's shattered leg and barked an order. Within minutes, Halvorsen was on a stretcher in a commandeered farm truck, bouncing along a rutted road toward a field hospital. The hospital occupied what had once been a schoolhouse. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The windows were blown out, covered with canvas. Inside, the smell of gangrene and carbolic acid created an atmosphere thick enough to taste. Wounded German soldiers lay on every available surface, desks pushed together, mattresses on the floor, stretchers balanced on sawhorses. Some moaned. Others lay in the terrible silence that preceded death. A doctor appeared, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that trembled from either exhaustion or shell shock. He cut away Halvorsen's flight suit, examined the wound. Shrapnel had torn through muscle and nicked the femoral artery, and began working with a speed and precision that seemed impossible given the chaos around them. "You are fortunate," the doctor said in careful English. 2 centimeters to the right, and you would have bled out before capture. Halvorsen, dizzy with pain and shock, could only stare. No waiting line. No deliberation about whether to waste medical supplies on an enemy pilot. The doctor worked on him with the same methodical care he would give to one of his own soldiers, clamping the artery, cleaning the wound, applying sulfa powder and bandages with hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Why? Halvorsen finally managed to ask through teeth gritted against the pain. "Why save me?" The doctor paused in his work, meeting the American's eyes. Behind his glasses, his gaze was infinitely tired. "Because I am a doctor," he said simply. "And you are human." Later, hours or days later, time blurred in the morphine haze, Halvorsen would learn that he had been one of 3 American airmen in that hospital. The others had died despite the doctor's efforts. He had survived because of a combination of luck, the Wehrmacht sergeant's quick thinking, and a German physician's refusal to let hatred override his oath. When the American forces overran the position a week later, liberating the hospital and its prisoners, Halvorsen had been strong enough to be moved. As they carried him out on a stretcher, he had looked back to see the German doctor still working, now on American soldiers and German prisoners alike, his hands steady, his face a mask of professional concentration. The encounter had cracked something open in Halvorsen's understanding of the war. The propaganda had been clear. Germans were monsters, fanatics, subhuman. Yet this doctor had saved his life without hesitation. The Wehrmacht sergeant had risked court-martial by taking a downed enemy pilot to a hospital instead of a POW cage. These acts of mercy, performed in the dying days of the Third Reich, suggested a complexity that the black and white morality of wartime could not accommodate. July 23, 1948, Tempelhof Airfield, present time. Halvorsen approached the fence with his 2 sticks of gum, aware of how inadequate the gesture was. The children watched him come, their expressions guarded but curious. He stopped a few feet away, separated from them by chain link and 3 years of history. "Does anyone speak English?" he asked. A girl of perhaps 12, thin as a rail, her blonde hair cut short in a practical bob, stepped forward. "I speak some," she said. Her accent was thick, but her grammar was careful. Halvorsen held up the gum. "I'd like to give you this," he said, "but there's only 2 sticks, and there are so many of you." The girl translated quickly. A murmur ran through the group of children. Then, to Halvorsen's astonishment, they began to organize themselves. No fighting, no grabbing. The older children stepped back, creating a clear hierarchy. The 2 youngest, a boy with a bandage on his head and a girl missing her front teeth, were gently pushed forward. Halvorsen tore the gum in half, then in half again, creating 8 pieces from 2 sticks. He passed them through the fence. The children who received pieces carefully broke them even smaller, distributing fragments to those who had gotten nothing. Within minutes, 35 children were each chewing a morsel of gum no larger than a grain of rice. But what happened next transfixed Halvorsen completely. The children who had not received even a fragment pressed close to those who had, breathing in the scent of mint and sugar. Their eyes closed. Small smiles appeared on their faces. They were, Halvorsen realized, experiencing the gum vicariously, through scent and imagination, and they seemed genuinely happy to do so. "When did you last have candy?" Halvorsen asked the blonde girl. She thought for a moment, translating the question to herself, making sure she understood correctly. "Before the war," she said finally. "I was 5. My father brought home marzipan for Christmas. It was shaped like a pig, pink, with a little tail. The war had ended 3 years ago. This girl had spent more than half her life in deprivation so total that a memory of marzipan from 7 years past remained vivid and precious." "What do you want most?" Halvorsen asked, the question coming out before he had fully formed it. Again, the girl translated for the group. A brief discussion ensued, quiet and serious. Then she turned back to Halvorsen. "Freedom," she said, "and that you keep flying. The planes mean we will not starve. They mean the Russians cannot force us to live under their rules. We do not need candy. We need you to keep coming." Halvorsen felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of dignity that transcended nationality or recent enmity. These children, who had lived through the apocalypse of Berlin's fall, the Soviet artillery barrages, the house-to-house fighting, the mass rapes, the starvation of the first occupation year, were not asking for personal comfort. They were asking for the political abstraction of freedom, and they were willing to stand at this fence day after day, silent and disciplined, trusting that the former enemy would not abandon them. "I'll be back tomorrow," Halvorsen said impulsively. "When I fly in, I'll bring more gum and chocolate. I'll drop it from the plane as we come into land. But you'll need to know which plane is mine." The children leaned forward, suddenly animated. "How will we know?" the girl asked. Halvorsen thought for a moment. "When I approach the runway, I'll wiggle the wings of my plane. You'll see it rock back and forth. That's how you'll know it's me." The girl's face lit up with a smile that transformed her gaunt features. She translated rapidly, and the group of children erupted, not in loud shouts, but in a kind of contained excitement, hand squeezes and quick embraces, as if they had learned that even joy must be rationed. June 24th, 1948. 29 days earlier. The Soviet blockade begins. The city that Halvorsen had flown into 3 weeks ago was a study in contrasts so stark they seemed designed by some cosmic ironist. West Berlin, 2.1 million people, 185 square miles, an island of tenuous democracy surrounded by the Soviet occupation zone and the newly formed German Democratic Republic. The Soviets had cut every land route, roads, rail lines, canals, strangling the city's supply lines in an attempt to force the Western Allies to abandon their sectors or accept Soviet terms for reunification. The decision to resist had been made at the highest levels. President Truman, unwilling to yield another inch to Stalin's westward expansion. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, remembering Munich and the price of appeasement. French Foreign Minister Georges Bidault, torn between fear of Germany and fear of the Soviet Union, ultimately siding with his wartime allies. The airlift had begun as a stopgap measure, a way to buy time while diplomats negotiated. No one believed it could actually work. The mathematics seemed impossible. 2.1 million people needed 4,500 tons of supplies per day just to survive. Food, coal for cooking and heating, raw materials for the factories that provided employment. The 3 airports in the western sectors, Tempelhof in the American sector, Gatow in the British sector, and the not yet completed Tegel in the French sector, would need to handle an aircraft every 3 to 4 minutes, around the clock, in all weather, for an indefinite period. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of Germany, had told Washington bluntly, "We stay in Berlin, period." His British counterpart, General Sir Brian Robertson, had been equally adamant. The airlift, dubbed Operation Vittles by the Americans and Operation Plainfare by the British, became the largest humanitarian mission in history. By late July, the impossible was becoming merely improbable. 400 aircraft, C-47s, C-54s, Skymasters, British Avro Yorks, and Handley Page Hastings flew in a continuous stream along 3 narrow air corridors from West Germany to Berlin. Pilots flew in shifts, some making 4 or 5 round trips per day, landing at Tempelhof or Gatow, taxiing to unloading areas where German workers, many of them former Luftwaffe personnel, swarmed over the aircraft, removing cargo with practiced efficiency. Turnaround time: 30 minutes or less. Halvorsen had been flying the route for 3 weeks. Part of the 17th Troop Carrier Squadron based at Rhein-Main Air Base near Frankfurt. The routine was numbing. Load up with 10 tons of flour sacks, fly the corridor north to Berlin, land at Tempelhof, watch the German workers unload, take off again, return to Rhein-Main. Repeat. The only variation came from weather. Summer thunderstorms that made the approach to Tempelhof terrifying. The narrow corridor between Soviet-controlled territory offering no room for deviation. He had expected to feel nothing for the Germans. 3 years after VE Day, the newsreel still showed footage of concentration camps, emaciated survivors, mass graves. The Nuremberg trials had revealed the full scope of Nazi atrocities. How could one feel sympathy for the people who had enabled such horrors? Yet the reality on the ground was more complicated. The Germans working the flight line at Tempelhof were not SS officers or party fanatics. They were mechanics, clerks, former soldiers trying to feed their families in a city where the official ration provided 1,500 calories per day. Enough to delay starvation, not enough to maintain health. The black market thrived, but prices were astronomical. 1 American cigarette could buy a week's worth of bread. A Hershey bar was worth more than a day's wages. The children at the fence complicated things further. They were the generation that had grown up under Nazism, educated in schools where Hitler's portrait hung above the blackboard, where textbooks taught racial science and the glory of war. Yet what Halvorsen saw in their faces was not ideology, but simple human need, and a kind of desperate hope that the former enemy might prove more merciful than the current occupier. July 24th, 1948. The first drop. Halvorsen kept his promise. He enlisted 2 crew members, his co-pilot First Lieutenant John Pickering and Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Herschel Elkins, in what he called Operation Little Vittles, though at first it had no official name, no authorization, no recognition beyond the 3 of them and the chocolate bars they pooled from their rations. The engineering challenge was simple, but required ingenuity. They needed to create small parachutes that would slow the candy's descent enough to prevent injury, but still be cheap and easy to produce. Halvorsen sacrificed 3 handkerchiefs, tying the corners together with string and attaching small bundles of Hershey bars and Wrigley's gum. The result looked crude, almost comical, but physics would do the rest. On the approach to Tempelhof, with the plane descending through 1,000 feet, Halvorsen rocked the wings, left, right, in the signal he had promised. Through the cockpit window he could see the children at the fence, jumping and waving. Then he gave the order, and Elkins pushed the candy parcels out the cargo door. The 3 handkerchief parachutes deployed, drifting lazily downward through the summer air. From above, Halvorsen watched the children scatter across the field, tracking the parachute's descent. One landed near the fence, immediately surrounded by a cluster of kids. Another drifted toward the runway, prompting a mad dash that ended with a triumphant retrieval just before a British York taxied past. The third caught an updraft and sailed over the fence into the Soviet sector, lost to history and the East German police. It was absurd, Halvorsen thought as he brought the C-47 down for landing. Absurd and small and utterly inadequate. 3 parachutes, maybe 20 chocolate bars. What difference could it possibly make? The answer came the next day when he returned to the fence. The crowd of children had doubled. 70, maybe 80 of them pressed against the chain link, waiting. The blonde girl from the previous day pushed through to the front. "More will come tomorrow," she said, her English more confident now. "Everyone is talking about the chocolate uncle. Uncle Wiggly Wings, they call you. Will you drop again?" Halvorsen looked at the expectant faces, at the hope that had been kindled by such a small gesture, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "I'll drop again," he said, "but I'll need more supplies. Can you organize the children? Make sure the younger ones get first priority?" The girl nodded seriously. "We will organize. We always organize. It is how we survive." August through December 1948. Operation Little Vittles becomes official. What began as one pilot's impulsive act of kindness metastasized into something larger, driven by forces beyond Halvorsen's control. A German journalist had witnessed the drops and written a story for a local newspaper. The story was picked up by the wire services. Within a week, it appeared in American newspapers. Candy Bomber brings sweet relief to Berlin's children. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters began arriving at Rhine-Main Air Base, addressed simply to the chocolate pilot or Uncle Wiggly Wings. Some contained money. Others contained candy, carefully wrapped and packed, sent by church groups, school children, civic organizations across America. A classroom in Ohio sent 100 handkerchiefs to be used as parachutes. A company in Massachusetts donated 5,000 chocolate bars. The Wrigley Company shipped in cases of gum. The American Military Command faced a dilemma. Technically, Halvorsen had violated regulations by dropping items from his aircraft without authorization. But the public relations value of the story was immense. A powerful counter-narrative to Soviet propaganda that painted the airlift as American imperialism. General William Tunner, commander of the airlift operation, made the pragmatic choice. He authorized the candy drops and expanded them into an official program. By September, 25 aircraft were participating in candy drops, dispersing their sweet cargo over designated zones around Tempelhof and Gatow. Engineers designed better parachutes using surplus silk and nylon. Ground crews in the United States began pre-packaging candy into drop-ready bundles. The scale expanded from hundreds of pounds to tons per month. The children, for their part, adapted with remarkable efficiency. They created collection zones, established rules about fair distribution, and developed a sophisticated intelligence network that tracked which planes were likely to drop and where. The older children protected the younger ones during the scrambles for falling parachutes. The handicapped and sick received preferential treatment, with healthy children bringing them portions from the drops. Halvorsen, flying his regular airlift routes, watched the operation grow beyond anything he had imagined. What had started with 2 sticks of gum and 3 handkerchiefs had become a symbol of hope for the entire city. The Germans called it Rosinenbomber, the Raisin Bombers, and the term carried no trace of irony or resentment. The same aircraft that had once dropped high explosives on German cities now rained down chocolate and chewing gum, a transformation so complete it seemed almost biblical. But beneath the feel-good narrative, Halvorsen grappled with harder questions. Why did this matter so much? Why did a few tons of candy, insignificant compared to the 4,500 tons of flour and coal arriving daily, capture the imagination of both Americans and Germans? The answer, he came to believe, lay in the symbolism of the act. The flour and coal were necessities, transactions born of political calculation and strategic interest. The candy was different. It served no practical purpose. It would not keep anyone alive through the coming winter. But it represented something beyond survival, the idea that even enemies could become friends, that mercy could exist without utility, that human kindness could transcend the hatreds of recent history. December 1948 through May 1949, the winter test. The first winter of the blockade tested the airlift to its limits. Fog rolled in from the North Sea, reducing visibility to near zero. Ice formed on wings and runways. The 3-minute spacing between aircraft became 4 minutes, then 5, as pilots groped their way down through the murk using primitive radar and sheer nerve. Coal became more precious than food. The power plants that heated the city and kept its factories running consumed 1,000 tons per day. Without heat, the city would freeze. The airlift crews began flying loads that were almost entirely coal, dirty, heavy, corrosive to aircraft engines, but absolutely essential. The candy drops continued, though at reduced frequency. On days when the weather was too dangerous for normal operations, when aircraft were crashing with fatal regularity due to ice and fog, the candy missions were scrubbed. But on clear days, the parachute still fell, a defiant assertion of normalcy in abnormal times. Halvorsen, promoted to captain, found himself becoming a public figure, a role he neither sought nor particularly enjoyed. Reporters requested interviews. The military brass wanted him to visit schools and civic groups to put a human face on the airlift. He complied, dutiful but uncomfortable, aware that he was being used for propaganda purposes but unable to refuse without seeming churlish. The children's letters kept coming, hundreds per week now, carefully written in painstaking English or translated by teachers and parents. They were heartbreaking in their simplicity. Dear Chocolate Uncle, thank you for the gum. It was my first taste of sweetness in 4 years. I shared it with my little brother. He is 6 and does not remember what candy tastes like. Now he knows. God bless you. Margaret, age 13. Dear Uncle Wiggly Wings, I am writing to thank you for your kindness. My father was killed in the war. My mother says we must not hate Americans because the war is over and hate only makes more suffering. Your chocolate proves she is right. I am learning English in school so I can write to you without help. Klaus, age 11. Dear American pilot, yesterday I caught one of your parachutes. Inside was a Hershey bar. I have never tasted chocolate before. I cut it into 20 pieces and gave 1 piece to each child in my building. Everyone said it was the best thing they ever ate. Thank you for remembering us. Dieter, age 9. Halvorsen kept every letter, storing them in footlockers that grew increasingly crowded as the months passed. He tried to imagine the lives behind the words, the bombed-out apartment buildings, the rationed meals, the fathers who were dead or missing or imprisoned in Soviet camps, the mothers who worked 12-hour shifts clearing rubble for pennies. May 12, 1949. The blockade ends. At 1 minute past midnight, the Soviets reopened the Autobahn to West Berlin. The blockade, which had lasted 318 days and killed 78 Allied personnel in aircraft accidents, ended not with a whimper, but with a roar of truck engines as convoys from West Germany began rolling through the checkpoints. The airlift, however, continued for several more months, stockpiling supplies in case the Soviets changed their minds. In total, the Allied air forces had delivered 2.3 million tons of supplies on 278,000 flights. The statistics were staggering, the achievement unparalleled in aviation history. But for Halvorsen, the numbers that mattered were different. By the time Operation Little Vittles officially ended in September 1949, the candy drops had delivered more than 23 tons of chocolate, gum, and other sweets to the children of Berlin. 18 tons of chocolate, 3 tons of gum. The rest assorted candies donated by Americans who wanted to participate in this small act of reconciliation. 18 tons. It sounded like a lot until you divided it among the 400,000 children in West Berlin, which yielded roughly 90 pounds per child over the course of the operation, or about 1 chocolate bar every 10 days. A rounding error, really, in the grand calculus of human need. Yet the impact could not be measured in pounds or calories. The candy drops had become a myth, a story the children of Berlin would tell their own children. The time when the former enemy brought them chocolate from the sky, when American pilots wiggled their wings in greeting, when kindness arrived on small parachutes made from handkerchiefs. June 1949. Halvorsen returns to the fence. Before rotating back to the United States, Halvorsen made one final visit to the fence at Tempelhof. The children were there, as always. Though their numbers had thinned now that the immediate crisis had passed, the blonde girl who had translated for him on that first day pushed through the crowd, taller now, less gaunt, her face fuller with the improved rations that peace and open supply lines had brought. "You are leaving?" she asked. Her English had improved dramatically over the past year. "Tomorrow," Halvorsen confirmed. "Back to America. But others will continue the drops for a while longer." The girl nodded, accepting this. "We will not forget," she said, "what you did for us. Not just the candy, though we loved the candy, but what it meant. That you saw us as children, not as Germans. That you cared whether we had something sweet." Halvorsen felt emotion tighten his throat. "I have to tell you something," he said. "Something I've never told anyone. When my plane was shot down in 1945, I was captured by the Wehrmacht. I was wounded, bleeding badly. I thought they would shoot me. Instead, they took me to a hospital. A German doctor operated on me, saved my life. He had no reason to help me, but he did." The girl listened intently, her young face serious. "I've thought about that doctor a lot during this past year," Halvorsen continued, "about why he saved me. I think it's because he understood something that war makes us forget, that our common humanity is more important than our tribal differences, that mercy is not weakness, that even in the worst circumstances, we can choose kindness." "Is that why you dropped the chocolate?" the girl asked. "To repay the doctor who saved you?" Halvorsen considered this. "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe I just wanted to see if we could be better than the worst version of ourselves." If we could transform enemies into friends through simple acts of generosity. The girl smiled, and in that smile, Halvorsen saw the future. Not the rubble and ruin of post-war Berlin, but the rebuilt city that would rise from the ashes, the democracy that would take root in the western sectors, the reconciliation between former enemies that would eventually lead to alliance and friendship. "We are friends now," the girl said simply. "You and us, Americans and Germans." The chocolate proved it. It was, Halvorsen thought, a child's oversimplification of complex geopolitical realities. Yet it was also profoundly true in a way that transcended politics. The candy drops had created a bond between giver and receiver, had humanized both sides in each other's eyes, had planted seeds of reconciliation that would take decades to fully mature, but which started here, in this small moment of connection between a pilot and the children he had come to care about. 1974. Berlin. 25th anniversary of the airlift. Halvorsen returned to Berlin for the commemorative ceremonies. A middle-aged man now, retired from the Air Force as a colonel, living a quiet life in Utah. The city he found bore little resemblance to the ruins he remembered. West Berlin had transformed into a prosperous island of capitalism, its broad avenues lined with shops and cafes, its people well-fed and well-dressed, living under the protection of American, British, and French troops who guaranteed the city's freedom against the Communist East. The wall, built in 1961, now divided the city physically as well as ideologically. Halvorsen could see it from his hotel window, a brutal concrete barrier topped with barbed wire, a monument to the Cold War's frozen conflict. Yet West Berlin thrived despite, or perhaps because of, its precarious position, a showcase of Western democracy and free market economics. At the commemorative ceremony at Tempelhof, Halvorsen found himself surrounded by middle-aged Germans who had been children during the blockade. They approached him hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as they recognized the white-haired American who had once wiggled his plane's wings in greeting. "I caught one of your parachutes," a man said. He was perhaps 35 years old, stocky, prosperous-looking. July 1948. It had 3 Hershey bars inside. I shared them with my sister and my mother. It was the first chocolate I'd had in 5 years. "I still have the handkerchief," a woman said. She opened her purse and carefully withdrew a faded square of white cloth, the knots in the corners still visible. "It was the most precious thing I owned. I've kept it all these years." One by one, they came forward, these former children now approaching middle age, sharing their memories of that desperate year when the sky rained chocolate and hope came in small bundles tied to makeshift parachutes. Some wept, others laughed. All of them, Halvorsen realized, carried the memory of the candy drops as a defining moment of their childhood, proof that enemies could become friends, that mercy existed even in the aftermath of total war. The blonde girl from the fence appeared, though Halvorsen didn't recognize her at first. She was a woman now, 40 years old, elegantly dressed, her English flawless. "Captain Halvorsen," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Schmidt. We met at the fence in 1948. I was the one who translated for the other children." Halvorsen shook her hand, searching his memory. "Yes," the serious 12-year-old with careful English and an air of premature adulthood. "I remember," he said. "You organized the children, made sure everyone got a fair share." "I became a teacher," Margaret said. "I teach history at a gymnasium here in Berlin. Every year when we study the blockade, I tell my students about the candy drops, about Uncle Wiggly Wings and Operation Little Vittles, about the American pilot who taught us that former enemies could show kindness. Do they believe you? Halvorsen asked. In this age of cynicism, do young people believe that such simple gestures could matter? Margaret smiled. They believe it because I lived it, because I can show them the letters we wrote, the photographs of the parachutes, the newspaper articles, because the evidence is everywhere, if you know where to look. She paused, her expression turning serious, but more than that, they believe it because they need to believe it. Because if we can transform enemies into friends through acts of simple kindness, then perhaps there is hope for all the divisions that still plague our world. 1998, the final return. Halvorsen made his last trip to Berlin in 1998, 2 years before his 80th birthday. The city had changed beyond recognition. The wall had fallen 9 years earlier, and East and West Berlin were now united in the new German capital. The scars of division remained, empty lots where the wall had stood, buildings still pockmarked with bullet holes from the war. But the trajectory was clear. Forward, toward unity, toward prosperity, toward a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. At the German Museum of Technology, they had installed a Douglas C-47 at the entrance, suspended from cables so it appeared to be approaching for landing. A plaque explained its significance. One of the Rosinen bomber that had kept Berlin alive during the blockade, symbol of the American commitment to freedom and the German people's resilience in the face of Soviet tyranny. Children on school trips stood beneath the suspended aircraft, their faces upturned, listening as docents explained the mathematics of the airlift. One plane every 3 minutes, 4,500 tons per day. 11 months of continuous operations. Some of the children were Turkish or Arab, descendants of the guest workers who had helped rebuild Germany. Others were Polish or Russian, immigrants from the former Soviet bloc. All of them were German now, citizens of a reunified country that had transformed itself from pariah to partner, from enemy to ally. Halvorsen stood in the crowd, anonymous in his age, watching the children's faces as they processed the story of the airlift. Did they understand? Could they grasp what it meant to live in a city under siege, to depend on foreign pilots for survival, to place hope in the steady drone of aircraft engines overhead? Perhaps not. But perhaps that was the point. These children lived in a world where former enemies were now friends, where German and American soldiers served together in NATO, where the idea of war between Western nations seemed as remote as conflict with Mars. They could not comprehend the depths from which their grandparents had risen because they had never fallen into those depths themselves. That was the victory, Halvorsen realized. Not the tonnage delivered or the blockade defeated, but the world that had been built afterward, the transformation of enmity into alliance, the choice of reconciliation over revenge. Epilogue. The meaning of small gestures. Gail Halvorsen passed away on February 16, 2022, at the age of 101. He had lived long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse, the Berlin Wall fall, Germany reunite, and the children who once waited by the Tempelhof fence grow old themselves, grandparents now, passing down stories of the candy bomber to new generations. The obituaries noted his military service, his role in the Berlin Airlift, the numerous awards he received from both the United States and Germany. But what the statistics and honors could not capture was the simple human truth at the heart of his story, that in the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, when hatred would have been justified and vengeance expected, he chose instead to drop chocolate to children. It was such a small thing. 2 sticks of gum, 3 handkerchiefs, a few chocolate bars. Measured against the tonnage of the airlift, against the billions spent on reconstruction, against the massive geopolitical forces that shaped the post-war order, it was nothing. Yet it was everything. Because it proved that individual acts of kindness matter, that mercy is possible even between enemies, that the choice to see the humanity in others, even recent adversaries, can plant seeds that grow into forests of reconciliation. The children who caught those parachutes never forgot. They grew into adults who believed in the possibility of friendship across national boundaries, who rejected the tribal hatreds that had consumed their parents' generation, who built a new Germany based not on martial glory but on democratic values and European integration. Was this all due to the candy drops? Of course not. The transformation of Germany involved countless factors: the Marshall Plan, the occupation policies of the Western Allies, the patient work of German leaders like Konrad Adenauer, who chose democracy over revanchism. But the candy drops were part of that transformation, a symbol that became reality, a gesture that became policy, a pilot's impulse that became a nation's commitment. In the end, Halvorsen's legacy was not the 23 tons of chocolate he dropped from the sky. It was the idea that such gestures matter, that small acts of kindness can accumulate into something larger, that the choice to extend mercy instead of exact revenge can transform not just individuals, but entire societies. The children of Berlin looked up. What fell from the sky shocked them, not because it was terrible, but because it was kind. And in that shock of unexpected mercy, in that moment when chocolate and gum descended on tiny parachutes, a new future became possible. One where former enemies could become friends, where hatred could give way to hope, where the worst impulses of humanity could be overcome by its better angels. The planes kept flying, the wings kept wiggling, the chocolate kept falling. And slowly, improbably, impossibly, the world grew a little bit kinder, one small parachute at a time.